And good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's session of Food Literacy for All. We have a great session lined up for you, but first, a few announcements. First, as always, we'd like to thank our supporters. This class is brought to us from the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, and a lot of generous support across campus, including for the Center for the Education of Women, the Residential College, Kyle White, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Association, the School of Public Health, the School of Environment and Sustainability, and the Department of American Culture. Our teaching team includes myself, Dr. Jessica Kenyatta Walker, Shakira Tyler, and Lily Fink Shapiro, and includes our GSIs, Megan Gross and Nayexi Hernandez, as well as Kimmy Vandewedge and Chris Taylor, although this evening we have DJ Rain helping us. As always, tell your family, tell your friends, Food Literacy All is free and open to the public. All of our sessions are recorded and available online. Students, please do remember to attend with your UMich email. This is really important in helping us keep track of attendance. If you are a community attendee, we have some optional readings that are available for you at the SFSI website as well. As we're listening to lecture, be sure to tweet at us, hashtag Food Literacy for All at SFSI_UM. Our poll questions this evening are for each class, and they do count for attendance and a participation grade. A note for this evening that our 3 poll questions will be given in the first half of this lecture. So that is just a point for this evening. All classes are filmed and available at the SFSI website, and closed caption is available on Zoom. Please use the Q&A box at any point throughout the lecture to give questions to our speakers for this evening. It is in the bottom right, titled Q&A. And again, at any point during the lecture, you can submit a question. Our next session is in person, April 4th. We have Kiki Lua and Ederic Gudia. We'll meet at Angel Hall and Auditorium B at 6:30. And their talk is titled Equity Matters, the Rise and Fall and Future of Detroit's Restaurant Industry. So a quick update on recent events on campus that are important to this course. GEO is officially striking, that is the Graduate Employers Organization, around many issues related to conditions of work, including wage and tuition. But GEO also wants you to know that this is not about students. We know that the strike, or GEO knows that the strike directly affects everyone, but the strike is a response to UM administration and does not really find any fault with students. And if you want to know more around the strike and also the university's response to it, please see the information in the chat. And just noting that our GSIs do quite a bit, over 15 or 20 tasks, big and small, for this course every week and every day. And we're not really sure how long this will last. Our last strike, I think in 2020, was 3 to 4 days, but we will keep the class updated. We do have a few course adjustments to announce. So this week's quiz 11, will still be due normally at Friday at 5 p.m. All future quizzes, so next week and after, will be postponed until further notice. So these points will be subtracted from your course total. This will not affect your grade in any way. And again, we will keep you updated as things may or may not shift in the coming weeks. Participation and attendance, again, as you know, we regularly do through polls that will be counted. Your participation will continue to be gathered through Harmonize, but the grading of these things might be delayed. In terms of course communications, anything from the syllabus to how your teams are working to brainstorming ideas for assignments, your first step should always be those teamwork guidelines and the syllabus. I'll be sending an announcement on capstone frequently asked questions to help guide your final project. And then feel free to message me via Canvas and give me up to 48 hours for a response. Summer Internship Fellowship, this is for master's students from SFSI. a $3,000 stipend with the application due April 1st, which is coming up. This is a great opportunity for our master's students, so please do follow up with that. Okay, now I believe we have our polls. So the question is, when you hear the phrase regenerative agriculture, what does it bring up for you? So A, an approach to farming and ranching that builds soil health and carbon. B, renewing generational connection and knowledge in agriculture. C, repairing the harms of colonization and extractive agriculture. Or D, revitalization of ecological systems that have long histories of indigenous communities and communities of color. So again, we are taking all three of our poll questions at the top of class. This is a chance for you to kind of meditate and sit with the themes of this evening. So our question is, when you hear the phrase regenerative agriculture, what does it bring up for you? And I know we've had a few readings on this. Okay, so we have 42% chose A, an approach to farming and ranching that rebuilds soil health and soil carbon. And then a second at 27% is D, the revitalization of ecological systems that have long histories in indigenous communities and communities of color. Okay, let's move on to our next poll question. So this poll question asks, how have you experienced the relationship between academic knowledge and community-based knowledge? A, academic knowledge often ignores or misses the insights of community-based knowledge. Academic knowledge often appropriates community-based knowledge. Or C, academic knowledge and community-based knowledge can complement one another in addressing difficult challenges. So this one asks us to reflect on what was really another theme in this course, the relationship between academic knowledge, scholarly text, and what we understand as community-based knowledges. So how have you experienced that relationship? And I see a lot of folks going for C. There is possibilities for how they complement each other. Certainly, we've seen a few examples in class of that. Okay, just as a reminder, again, we are taking all three of our poll questions at the top of class to reflect on the themes of this lecture. So it seems like 28% of you chose C, that they can in fact complement one another. But in the second was that academic knowledge kind of misses the point here, misses some insights of community-based knowledges. Okay, our final poll question. How would you describe your relationship to animal agriculture? So how would you describe your relationship to animal agriculture? A, I have experience raising livestock, and good thing, chickens count. B, I don't have direct experience with animal agriculture, but I'm curious about it. C, my main relationship to animal agriculture is my concern about the harmful practices of factory farms. Or D, my main relationship to animal agriculture is that meat dishes are an important part of my diet / cultural foods. Okay, so here we have E also can be other, because certainly not everything is captured here. But we have a range of good choices here. Again, would you describe your relationship to animal agriculture? Okay, so it seems like most folks chose D. Main relationship is meat dishes because they're an important part of my diet or culture or both. And then we have C, my main relationship is my concern about harmful impacts of factory farms. And 16%, 35 of you have experience raising livestock, including chickens. Good to know. Okay, I think that will be it for our polls, and I will hand it off to Lily.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Food Literacy for All. It is such an honor to introduce our two guest speakers for Food Literacy for All tonight. Tonight, we have Liz Carlisle and Latrice Tatsi here, who will be in discussion with each other this evening about some really core themes of our class this semester: climate justice and the deep roots of regenerative farming. And Liz, I think that we last hosted you back in 2015 as a part of your Lentil Underground book tour that was in person in Ann Arbor. And Liz, I feel like since then I've learned so much from you, both through your writing, and also I really so deeply admire how you explicitly center social, racial, environmental, political values in everything you do. So Liz Carlisle is an assistant professor in the environmental studies program at UC Santa Barbara, and she teaches courses on food and farming, and even occasionally requires her students to virtually attend Food Literacy for All, which I love. I'll give it, I don't know if any of your students are on tonight, but I'll give a wave in case anyone is. And so was born and raised in Montana, and she got hooked on agriculture while working as an aide to organic farmer and US Senator John Tester, which then led to a decade of research and writing collaborations with farmers in her home state of Montana. And I wish I had them here to hold, but she's written 3 amazing books all about regenerative farming and agroecology. The first one I just mentioned was Lentil Underground in 2015. She co-authored Grain by Grain in 2019, and then most recently, a book called Healing Grounds, Climate, Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming. Liz has a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley and a BA in folklore and mythology from Harvard University. And then Liz, I don't know when I'm ever going to find this out about you, but I do know that prior to your career as a writer and academic, you spent years touring rural America as a country singer. I wish we had some of maybe a song by you to kick off the class, maybe one day. And Latrice Tatsi, thank you so much for being here tonight. Latrice I know we'll learn more about you, Latrice, but Latrice is a soil scientist and cultural science lead and intern supervisor at Pecunny Lodge Health Institute, PLHI. And she has worked with PLHI regenerative grazing initiative there for a couple of years, and also completed her master's thesis at Montana State University in the Department of Land Resources and Environmental Science. And her research sounds so fascinating. Her research focused on the way that cattle and bison influence soil health, and she worked with local beef cattle producers and the Blackfeet Nation tribal bison herd. Latrice was raised on her family's ranch on Badger Creek, Blackfeet Nation, and her family raises beef cattle. So I'm so looking forward to hearing more about you, and I'm so looking forward to tonight's discussion. Thanks again for being here. And now I will pass the mic to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be here. I am such a fan of Food Literacy for All. I think you all really demonstrate a high bar for what teaching and learning and transfer of knowledge, as Latrice is always reminding me, what that can look like in our field. So thank you so much for the invitation to join you this evening. We'll both say a little bit more about ourselves, and then we'll jump into a conversation. I'm going to moderate a conversation with Latrice. So just to kick it off, I'm Liz Carlisle. You've heard my formal bio. The reason I'm so jazzed about the topic of this course is really my grandmother. My grandmother, Helen Gordon, lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. And she was a really, really big influence on me, light in my life. And I loved this grounded wisdom that she had from building a really strong relationship to land as a young person. It was something I always wanted for myself. But at the same time, she was really honest with me about that experience of the Dust Bowl and the farm literally blowing away and, her family losing their livelihood, their community. And she was really concerned about the mismanagement of that land, her father overplowing it, getting that recommendation from US government agents, and really not taking good care of that land in Western Nebraska. And so she kind of set me on this path of curiosity about regeneration and repair. And I started, I went to graduate school and started talking to farmers in the organic movement. I grew up in Montana. I started there. And so about a dozen years ago, I kind of started on this journey of trying to understand what regeneration and repair on land and in agriculture looks like. And that first poll question from tonight definitely resonates with me, because I started this journey asking a lot of questions about soil carbon, and if we got more carbon in the soil, how could that help us maybe rebalance the climate? But the more that I continue to learn and talk with folks and explore, the scientists kept telling me, well, if you want more carbon in the soil, if you want ecological regeneration on farms, what we really need is deep roots. You need roots in the ground all year round, perennial plants, cover crops, right? And then I started asking, well, okay, what's preventing farmers from planting deep roots, or is the case that people have been getting uprooted on this continent for hundreds of years? Maybe we need to deal with that. And by the way, all these techniques that I've been learning about in the regenerative agriculture movement, they have deep histories in Indigenous communities and communities of color, Indigenous communities from North America, Indigenous communities in Africa, folks in the Black diaspora, Indigenous communities throughout the Americas who are in diaspora in the United States, Asian communities who are in diaspora in the United States. And so realizing that, I then had the incredible privilege to speak with some leaders in this really deep form of regenerative agriculture about both those deep histories, but then also why that those connected struggles around regeneration and sovereignty and liberation are so important right now in this contemporary moment. And Latrice was one of these wise women that I got to speak to for this book. And so I'm really just a very small player in this conversation as a conduit to gather us here. And I'm just delighted that you all get to hear directly from Latrice. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Latrice, to say a little bit more by way of introduction of yourself and your work.
Okay. Oki Nistuna Danaku and Niskamaki. Hello, my name is Latrice Tatsi. I will say that's my government name. My Pekani name is Buffalo Stone Woman. I was born and raised on my family ranch in Badger Creek, which I love and has been my inspiration for a lot of the work that I do and that I continue to do, because for me, it's about protecting the land that I come from, but also caring for it for my kids and their kids and so on for future generations, because I am the beneficiary of my previous generations to sustain the land that we're in. So holding that and honoring that has always been really important to me, and knowing the cultural value, knowing the identity to the land and the role that it plays in my life has been really important in who I am as a person and the work that influences me. I think if I had a different background, I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing. But because of my upbringing and my father's perseverance to teach me the ways of our people, as well as, telling me, it's important to go out and get your education. And so I always tell people, a lot of the times I refer to you walk in two worlds, because you walk, your indigenous path in your communities, but then also you work outside of it in this Western realm. In the pace of life is different in each. And so, I've been very honored to have an upbringing in both. And it's helped me become who I am and like I said, influence the work and what I do. And I enjoy it, and I enjoy finding ways to be a better land steward based on the teachings of the Pekani people, and how going back to the cultural teachings of my people is influencing the way that I am doing work today, which is putting an identity back into the land and building those relationships. Because I think what's happened over the years is we forget that the relationship that we have with the land is just as important. Our people understand Earth as Mother Earth. And so having that relationship, a healthy relationship with your mother, and also the mother of earth that takes care of you is also really important in those understandings of how this planet takes care of us and provides all the resources and sustains us. And so how do we become better stewards? And that's a lot of the work that I do with the teachings and the background and the work that I want to continue on for working with interns in just all capacities. It's just ensuring that we have access to healthy land, healthy water, healthy soils, and healthy animals, because we need healthy plant communities, because whether we understand it or not, everything's connected from below to the above to the above to the below, and understanding that it's not linear, that everything is a cycle. Whether we look at the carbon cycle, the nutrient cycle, everything's connected. So the influences that we make today are the influences that are coming for future generations. And so I always start with that, because what the conditions that we live in today are decisions that generations before us made, and we are in positions to make decisions that will benefit future generations. And I really think that's the power that we have in these type of environments, in these learning settings, to really foster that. And so I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Latrice. Yeah, and to jump in a little bit more to some of the first conversations that we had, I first reached out to you when I was researching this book because I was interested in learning more about regenerative grazing. So this idea that, in contrast to most contemporary cattle operations in the US, native herbivores on this continent moved across the landscape and grazed in a way that actually stimulated vegetation to regrow and build up soil carbon. And one aspect of your incredibly multidimensional work has been studying the ecological significance of a native herbivore with whom your community has a deep and long-standing relationship, Ini, also known as buffalo or bison in English. And at the same time, you've been working with others in your community to restore these animals to their homelands, to your homelands, to bring them home. And I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit, fill us in a little bit on the ecological and cultural significance of Ini and what you're noticing as they return to Blackfeet Nation.
For sure. One of the important pieces is any buffalo played such a significant role in our lives. It was our shelter, it was our food, it was our ceremony, a part of our ceremony. It was it was a part of everything. And so, having lost that piece for such a long time, not losing it, but having it taken away,
Hmm.
and it's like having a part of your identity withdrawn from you. And so you kind of lose a piece of yourself in some regard, because you don't have that. And so for me growing up, I always had to hear about ini in past tense. When I'd be riding in the hills with my dad, he'd be like, "Oh, these are those rock cairns. This is the buffalo jumps. These are the dog day teepees. These are the horse day teepees." That was all tied to the ini. And so growing up, it was always heard about it talked as past tense, and the tribe, started buffalo, and then there was some issues, and then, they had to sell out, and then now, they got their herd again. And so when, I was learning those histories, because my father was a caretaker of the tribal herd before, I started to really think, wow, these animals, were once such an important part of this ecosystem, and a keystone species, and then just to be removed and then put back on there, and what is that going to do? And so I always think about, first I think about the cultural value of it, because when these animals returned, people felt that connection. You seen locals going out and taking pictures, and making offerings and just really thankful for its return, because it, there's such a dark history of them being taken away, and that uncertainty to them returning, because now you have another, animal grazing where, cattle are now dominating these landscapes. So you come into different viewpoints of these animals, but I like to look at it in the um ecological impacts that they make, and how that is so much different than having to manage a cattle operation to do what what any do naturally. And so being able to be a part of the looking at their value on the land and how important that it is showing the sustainability of the animals, but also showing the sustainability of our culture. And now you have kids who get to go out during any days, which is held every June for the past 3 years. This will be the third year or fourth year, one of them. And you have students who go out and participate and get to see the tribal bison herd and get to learn the different parts of the animal, but they also get to participate in the harvest. And a lot of the times these kids have never been a part of watching um that happen, and so they get to see the ceremonial part where the elders are praying over the individual who's going to take the animal's life. So there's a whole process before you even go take that animal's life that you have to go through. And so the kids see that firsthand, that it's just not going out to the field and taking that animal's life. It's honoring that animal and knowing that we are honoring that animal, because that animal is going to lose its life to sustain our lives. And so it's something that's coming full circle. And so that's really important in when we're working with our youth and doing that outreach and letting them know, because a lot of them never seen that before, and letting them know, like, this is a part of who you are, and this is an important piece. It's so much more than watching them be out there on the grasslands and graze. It's about who you are and who they are as an animal and what your relationship means. And so bringing that back has been really powerful. And so I work with producers on the cattle end, and a lot of them are for reintroducing any to our landscape, but it really comes to finding areas that won't so much conflict with them losing grazing for their cattle. And sometimes those can be really tense conversations, because I'm for both animals, and I see the importance of both. And so I want to work with ways to where everybody can find a balance and know that not everybody's going to get the upper hand, but finding where we could work with one another, and we're just working on some introductions pieces up at well, I'm not me, but partnering with some organizations who are looking at reintroducing any up by the Chief Mountain and Glacier National Park area, and what that will look like for the community. And so they asked me, is there ranchers up there we could talk to start, these conversations about them being released. And so, me knowing the agricultural side and knowing the cultural side too, I'm able to make those connections with these producers and have those hard conversations and find the balance, because it's they play such a important role on the landscape. And I see that with the two. Well, I had three, but now I have two, the two buffalo that I introduced back to my ranch, and just seeing the role that they play. I tried everything. Like I said, I was on a cattle ranch, and I was like, oh, got some electric fence. And I was like, I'm going to train them to some electric fence. And I put them in this small little pen, and I was like, they'll adjust. And they was like ping pong ball, they was like boom, 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 boom. And then they found a tree stump, and they cut on the tree stump and jumped over the electric fence, and like jump into the creek, the Badger Creek, and they were in there for like 45 minutes. And I honestly, I was taking more pictures of them and just like, then I was upset at them jumping out of the electric fence I was trying to train them to. And then next week, like in the next coming weeks, like we were kind of going to the end of August, and a beaver started, building a dam and holding water back where the buffalo pasture was. And I was like, oh wow, maybe there was a reason why they jumped out and wanted to go into the water, because that was the first time that they had been introduced to the creek since I had brought them out to the ranch as young calves. And so for me, it's really been learning more about when you bring them to the land, because they're a keystone species, did they go out and cue another keystone species? What was the beaver? And so I'm just learning these things as I'm observing them out on the land. And so those values are so important, but also the value that they bring for food sustainability for our people, because with having the buffalo meat here and having our people having access, not in the quantities that we want right now because we're building the herds, but right now it really comes down to making sure they have adequate land base before the increase in herd size. But that food, goes to the elders when they do harvest those animals, and goes to people who are going to do ceremonies. And so they do sell uh jerky from the tribe's buffalo herd, and it's so good. And they're starting to reach a bigger market now that the animals numbers are getting higher. But it's about that food sustainability, but that food sovereignty also, of being able to provide your own food for your own people. And so we have such a beautiful and diverse ecological system up on the Blackfeet Nation, that we have the mountains, we have the foothills, we have the prairies and in the plains, and it just, all these ecos and all the plant communities and how they change. And so for us, it's really about protecting that, because we're at the headwaters of the crown, and we have so many abundant resources. And so it's really protecting them and the ecosystems that they come from, and looking at the NE and the role that they play and how they are going to be catching grass seed in their fur, and then redistributing it with the way their hooves work, and looking at how important those relationships are for diversity of plant communities out on the land, and looking at how you get a diversity of forbs, shrubs, sedges, and grasses, and knowing that, just like the importance of farming and having a diverse crop and how that benefits the soil, the same as in a native grassland, um, uh, native grasslands, having that diversity on the land is just as important. And so looking at how buffalo naturally are those stewards, I take and I learn from them based on their behavior, because I come in as a student and they are my teacher, and I take from them what they want to teach me and what they want to show me. And so in our creation stories, the animals were always the ones to teach the people about the land and the plants. And so when I think about that, and I'm sitting out there as a researcher and a scientist and pondering things, I just remember to sit there and observe what's naturally going on in the ecosystem and the landscape, because that will tell me more than making all these assumptions and these hypotheses in my head, which is, it's really important to have those, but also to really be observant of the natural systems, because you learn so much from them.
Mm. Yeah, I was really fascinated to hear you talk about your process, essentially. Because the phrase I hear you use a lot to describe your work is cultural science. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what that term means to you, and how you're weaving together traditional ecological knowledge, community-based knowledge at Blackfeet Nation, as well as your graduate training in ecology at Montana State. All this, as you mentioned, like all of this training you have in this Western framework.
For sure. So one of the things that when I first started the university system, I was just like, trying to look at how I can incorporate our knowledge and our teachings. And the term indigenous knowledge had been out there. And I was like, but I'm working with so many other cultures and people from different backgrounds that the science that I'm doing is specific to my culture and our ways of knowing and our ways of doing. And so when I went to meet with my advisor, because he was like, how are you going to come up with this, the your question and everything. And I was like, I kind of want to use, traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. And he was like, well, how is that relevant? And I was like, kind of like doored. And I was like, what do you mean? It's the word ecological and knowledge is in there. And then it really made me think. And I was like, everything that our people know is based on their cultural teachings, this indigenous knowledge base. And so I really like the term cultural knowledge because it's based on our people and our practices based on the land and where we come from. And different I know they have biocultural science, but for me that's the term that I like, and I know people use different terms for it, but that's really how I see in science was through my culture. And so cultural science just really stuck with me in that regard, because as people we all have ways of doing things based on how we learn in our ways of knowing, and we are all indigenous to and land area, whether it's here on this uh piece of land or in different areas on Mother Earth, but we all have that indigenous identity to this land. And the way we do things is based on our culture and our cultural practices. So for me, that was really how I honed in on cultural science, because I was meeting with so many people who from different cultures, and I remember one, her name was Badama. She was doing science her projects in Mongolia where she was from, and they looked at how the horse imprint in the soil, the people would look at how that was an indicator for soil moisture and looking at different things. And she was having a hard time in the academic system because they're like, it needs to be more hardcore science. She would bring it back to her people, and her people would be like, how does that even apply to us? That hasn't, so then I realized what those barriers were, how they were, being put up. And I was like, this is a term how we could break it down, because it's more inclusive of who you are in your cultural upbringing, in your ways of doing, in your ways of understanding. And so for me, that was the baseline of cultural science and how I've really developed the term.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of resonance there with a lot of the work that some of the folks in this Zoom room with us are doing in the greater Detroit area. So I appreciated you. And I learned a lot more about the whole, web of ideas around that term too. Another thing, that I've noticed in our conversations is that you often talk a lot about the importance of youth as the next generation of land stewards at Blackfeet Nation. And since finishing your master's degree at Montana State, and even during the time you were completing your research, you've invested a great deal of time in the regenerative grazing internship program you lead at Piikani Lodge Health Institute, as well as mentoring your own 3 children and involving them in your research. And I just loved that photo that you sent me a couple years ago of all of you in the lab together. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about why you see youth as so central to this work of regeneration and land repair.
For sure. For me, I was taught that we don't do the work for us. We always do the work for the next generation. And when we were talking about the term regeneration, to me, the first thing that come up was, the next generation, regeneration, like regenerative, all these things. And for me, it was always like the generation thing come up. And I'm like, that's who we do it for. And this is who needs to be involved in the work is the youth. And so my focus was providing internships. And I remember when Pecunny Lodge first come to me, they're like, we'll give you this money. You could do this work. And I was like, let's cut that in half. I'm already learning. I'm already a broke college student. I can make this work with me and my kids, but let's hire some other students to help me. And that's how it started for Pecunny Lodge. But prior to that, I worked at Blackfeet Community College, and they were like, you could have money to hire a secretary or an administrative assistant. And I was like, I got by internships in college, and that's how I fed my children, let's provide some internships to students and let's see what we can do. And from that very moment, that's been my foundation of always realizing that the only way this work is going to continue on is by investing in our youth. And so I was lucky enough to grow up in a family where they were like, as soon as you reach like 7 to 9, you're old enough to ride a horse up in the mountains. You are getting this experience, whether you wanted to or not. Like, that is like how you are fully dubbed into the family who's like hunting and camping and, goes to the mountains to just restore the spirit of, because they're the energy is so powerful back there. You can feel your ancestors. And I go back there, and I don't hunt like my family does. That was never, I could never do it. Like, I like to pet my buffalo, and I'll eat someone else's buffalo, but that's just not been, I've never been the strong one for that. But just having those relationships and seeing that, how important that is, because if my dad didn't bring me or raise me the way he did and invest in me the way he did, bouncing around, not going to preschool, learning my ABCs, my 1, 2, 3s, like how to spell my name, my colors, he would be like, there's a green leaf, there's a purple flower, like, learning all that off the land. If I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to pass it on. And I always seen my dad, he worked at Blackfeet Community College too. And so I always seen him teaching the cultural aspect, but he would also have elders, a lot of elders in his classes. And he would pretty much just ask them a question and be like, well, I don't know. And he'd be like, no, you do know. Tell us a story. And pretty soon he would be like, Latrice, they'd be teaching the entire class. And he said, but they were so afraid to speak their knowledge because during the mission school era and all that, that was frowned upon to share your knowledge. You weren't supposed to. You were supposed to, become a citizen. And so that was kind of lost. And so my dad always made it a point to me, because his grandparents and his parents, made it a point to, like, you share this because it was almost lost, and you give people those opportunities. So for me, knowing that I've had those opportunities, that I wanted to provide those to the youth, and a lot of the students that I get for these internships, a lot of them haven't had the access to land, especially on the Blackfeet Nation, of just going to all these private property and seeing the biodiversity that we have, and getting to meet the landowners. So for me, it's really, building these relationships, and so the youth understand how the land's being used and know what resources are available, and what we could do to be better land stewards. Because I don't ask a student to be from a specific background. I take a student from, I had students in psychology, criminal justice. I had a student in nursing who did an internship at BCC and then decided to switch her major and went into foods at Montana State University and is now running Fast Blackfeet. Her name's Danny Antelope. And I didn't know that. Because of the internship she had with us, that switched her from being nursing, until she told me like 2 weeks ago. And I was like, what, really? And so learning the value that these internships have in changing people to do the work that Danny's doing, where she's, you know, providing food and finding ways to get people in all the communities their resources, because we live in a food desert and because things are super expensive, and we live in a low, like a high unemployment rate with low, job opportunities because of the area we live in. So, her being creative and finding ways to help families when it comes to food and look at, food insecurity and how to work with ways to offset it in some regard. Those things are really powerful when we look at how our impact to youth and interns and students can influence the work that they'll do in the future.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And I got to meet Danny when I was back in Montana, and yeah, I can't imagine a bigger testament to the power of your mentorship.
She's amazing. She's amazing.
Yeah, well, I want to pass off pretty soon here because I can see we've got some questions. So I want to hand it off in a few minutes to Jessica and Shakira, who I think are going to moderate some of these questions. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you one more thing. I would love to hear anything you can share about how we can support your important work, and anything else you'd like to share about how non-native people can be good allies to these critical efforts to restore Indigenous food sovereignty and land sovereignty.
For sure. And I think one of it is just, know where you're at now and just recognize whose land it was before and what relationships they had prior to with the land, because I always learn so much when I go to places and I'm like, what Indigenous communities were here? What were they doing? And I always make it a time to learn about another culture. And so for me, you know, taking the time to take the time to learn about other people and is really important. And then just, you know, I I don't know, just reaching out to people in the communities that you work in, and just seeing, how you could be a person to make change, or to create opportunity, because we all have a gift, and how we utilize our gift and how we share our gift with others is how creator, God, or however you view the higher up put us here for a purpose. And I firmly believe that. And growing up, I never thought I would be doing the work that I'm doing. I grew up on a ranch. I was like, rodeo, all this stuff, and then I'm on my path now, and I'm like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and get to care for my animals and get to do these things that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so I'm always fortunate to, you know, be on the path that I am and run into people that I do, because I feel like it's always a part of the bigger plan.
So powerful. All right. Well, with that, it's been a huge privilege for me to get to ask Latrice all these questions. And I always love hanging out with Latrice for as much time as I possibly can. We got to take an amazing long train ride from Seattle to Portland together last year. And yeah, there's just so many powerful stories. It just never stops what Latrice has to share. But I'm going to step out of this seat of privilege here and hand over to Shakira and Jessica to moderate questions from all of you.
Awesome. Thanks, Latrice and Liz. It was so great to listen to these stories. And I love this particular medium of sharing knowledge, like just storytelling, right? Like it doesn't have to be super luxury or formal or otherwise, right? Like this is so intimate and powerful in so many ways. So thank you We really appreciate it. So let's jump into this Q&A. See some really dynamic questions here. Okay, TK has heard some people use traditional knowledges in the plural to represent different Indigenous peoples having different approaches to knowledge gathering. So what do you think about this shift? Does semantics matter, plural or not, or is the shift to cultural knowledge more representative of Indigenous approaches?
You know, I guess it's up to the individual person in their preference. Um, I know there's been a lot of books written on uh, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous science. So I guess it's just up to the person's preference on what they prefer.
Thank you for that. Liz, would you like to add something?
I definitely have nothing to add.
Okay. All right, no worries. Thanks. That was wonderful. All right, moving on. Could Latrice tell us how she negotiates differences in race, gender, and culture, not to mention nations, in developing a balance between cattle ranching and buffalo reintroduction regeneration?
I guess one of the things that I look at is when the buffalo were taken away, they were taken away in such a way that was negative, in a way that they were viewed as not culturally important to Indigenous people. And into that regard, I take that into consideration when I'm talking with anybody about cattle operations or any buffalo operations, that each animal is tied to someone's culture, whether someone views buffalo or any as being the enemy, or someone views cattle as being the enemy. Each animal is tied to someone's culture, and they are culturally important. And so when I am talking to any individual about that, I always keep that piece in mind, because at one time our any were taking away because it wasn't seen as important or as value, and I just don't want to see that happen anymore. I feel like a lot of times they pit one against the other, and there has to be a way to find balance with these animals, because both are going to be on this landscape to stay. And if we don't find ways to communicate openly and effectively, then it's just gonna um take longer to get more effective work done.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's really meaningful. Thank you for sharing that. And Liz, if you would like, please.
Yeah, I agree. That's incredibly powerful and incredibly generous. And I think, something that I learned in the course of speaking with Latrice, and also with Latrice's dad, I got to have some really wonderful conversations with him, is that during that period of time when buffalo were slaughtered by white colonizers, and Native people were also subjected to a great deal of violence and forced onto reservations that were really small subsets of territories that people had traditionally stewarded since time immemorial, that buffalo or any stewardship or relationship with that animal wasn't a possibility for a period of time. And people were really creative and resilient in figuring out how to sustain relationships with land through cattle, which was allowed in these colonial frameworks, was understood as valuable by these colonizers. And so I think that's a part of, when I look at this very complex situation, of something that I see is people's incredible resilience, resistance, innovation in figuring out how to navigate a very limiting situation. And yeah, so I think that's a part of my lens on thinking about this too. And just, I so admire the incredibly nuanced work that Latrice is doing in seeing the nuances of these histories and this movement towards sovereignty.
Mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion. I remember first hearing about the destruction of bison and how that related to the genocide of indigenous peoples from LaDonna Sims, who's a Black food justice activist with somewhat national prominence, who's really pushing, or at least I heard from her first, from any, compared to other people. Food apartheid is what we're really in, and not like, food deserts, which is the less preferred term at the grassroots level, given, multiple reasons. And so I remember her telling the story of how we have all become complicit in this really toxic food system. And we have to understand that justice starts back, or justice starts with remembering the genocide of indigenous peoples and the obliteration of the food supply, which the bison was the center of, and how that was really strategic from settler colonists, because to eliminate the people meant that you had to eliminate their food supply, right? And so that white settlers could then be the replacements and have ownership rights over the land and all of the other reasons, right? And so being new to the movement at that time and hearing that story, I was completely baffled and had no idea, right? And so I really appreciate you contextualizing that a bit for me today, especially from your particular tribal standpoint. So thank you so much. This is really important information for all of us. So we have some more questions coming in. How should universities support land back initiatives? How do they go beyond simple land acknowledgements? Oh yes, please. Let's talk about that. And actually cause change both on their campus and beyond.
One of the things that I think is really important is, besides the land acknowledgement, is giving Indigenous students a place to do the work that, is important to them culturally, and being open-minded when, especially in the university system, when you're coming from a cultural background and you're wanting to do projects that are directly linked to your community, and understanding that there's different types of knowledge. There's the stuff you can Google and find answers of scientific papers on, the Web of Science and all those, but also understanding that the knowledge base that is being shared by Indigenous communities is knowledge that is just as valuable as those papers and those publications in the Western society, and especially the science, because that knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge, the cultural knowledge that is being shared has been based on relationship building from time immemorial, and based in the survival of the people, in those stories, and the information is relevant to the information, and how it's being shared, and understanding that that form of knowledge needs to be just as equivalent as finding and all these studies and having all this data. And for me, that's one way that universities can really be kind of allies to students, especially Native students or students of color, when they're working with different communities. And understanding it's science isn't always linear, that they want it to be, that science is circular, and that they want to take the people out of science, but when you do that, you're taking an important ecological piece out, because we are a part of nature. We have evolved with nature. And so, you know, taking and honoring that information that is being shared, I think is one of the things that universities really struggle with, because they want that factual stuff, they want that hardcore data, and a lot of the times, and a lot of the work that you're doing in Native communities, you don't always get that type of information. And so finding a way to you know have have it honored in the university system across the United States is going to be ideal, as far in innovative in how we look at science and how we look at information sharing. Because we the situations that we're facing today, I don't think they'd be as extreme if indigenous or communities were involved in a lot of the conversations at first. And so now we're kind of going backwards to where, it's like, oh, we really messed up. No, let's go to these communities and see what they were doing, and the relationship that they have to the land. And so, first and foremost is just honoring the information and how it's shared from tribal communities. So that's especially for students doing research and work in the university system, because as a previous student, that's a lot of the barriers that were put up when I was doing my work.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Liz, would you like to add?
Just so wise. I'm just taking notes, thinking about how I can make these things happen in my institution.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm sure many others are as well. We talk a lot about this very issue at the University of Michigan. So thank you. Thank you for shedding light on that. All right, so there's a question here about the crossover between regenerative farming and biomimicry. So regenerative farming as a cultural science lens, respecting indigenous wisdom, and how that may relate to biomimicry. So are there any efforts that you've seen to bridge these disciplines together to address our food systems?
Go ahead, Liz. I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, well, I think I see a lot of commonality in the biomimicry conversation and the regenerative agriculture conversation, in that I think both are, relatively recent attempts by mostly white people to think about how looking to the natural world as a model or a teacher can better inform the way that agriculture is designed, and the way, in the case of biomimicry, lots of other things are designed too. So I think both are, mostly white settler communities, late to the party of learning frameworks that have informed land management in indigenous communities and communities of color for a long time. And I think, there can be value in both of those frameworks, so long as there's humility there and also a kind of recognition of history. I think when either one of those becomes ahistorical and kind of, a Columbusing effect, then they can actually be really harmful. And appropriation of knowledge and reinscription of hierarchy and exploitation and extraction. But I think there's possibility in them with that humility and historical and relational perspective.
And I guess just one of the things that comes to mind is just knowing that when you're working with the system, whether you're looking at it in a regenerative agriculture or you're looking at it in the bio viewpoint, is that looking at a system, you're not looking at it in like pre-touched. You're looking at a system now that has had influences of people in industry and all these things. So, you really got to find out what balances that you can bring to the system that will sustain itself in the world that we live in today. And I feel like those are some of the tools in which we're doing, because I can't say, hey, we can't go back to living historically in the teepees and being nomadic with the animals. It's just not the world we live in today. But finding ways to sustain the land with practices that were taught in ways that we can utilize them in the land base that we have now is probably, the most effective thing that we could do locally for our people, and understanding that the work that we do has to be local, based locally in our communities, because if we try to look outside of our communities, then we're not working with the people that we can influence the most and where the work can be most influential. And once we start that work within our communities, then it's easier to branch out and say, hey, this is what really worked for us, but this is what our direct needs were. And so really looking at how things are community based and needs based is, really looking at the bigger picture, whether you're looking at regenerative or the bio, but it's just looking at the community needs as a whole when you're adopting practices.
Right. Right. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. How would you approach informing ourselves on what animals are important to different cultures? So how do you think this knowledge will impact our knowledge of food systems and how to make our relationship with the food system more sustainable?
And for me, that just really happens to go back to, understanding the land you're on, and the indigenous people that it ties back to. Because when I travel to Wisconsin or Minnesota, I know that the indigenous peoples that I'm going to meet there, their main food base and supplementation is not going to be any. And so, going there and understanding like what foods do you eat, and doing that culture exchange to where we met an individual and he harvests maple syrup and turns the maple syrup byproduct into a vinegar. And so we were trading syrup for dry meat. And so just really knowing that, every indigenous person's culture and their food base is different. If you go more to the coast, they're more fish-based cultures, but the relationships that they have and the way they honor, whether it's a water species or a land species, that the way they value those animals is really an important part of their culture. And so um their food systems are very integrated into who they are in their cultural based practices.
Right, for sure. Yeah, that's a really important thing to understand. Liz, would you like to add?
I think just one thing that's been interesting for me, and another thing that huge insight for me in conversations with Latrice, sort of coming up in this sustainable food systems field and critical political economy of food and agriculture field, I came to see trade as a dirty word, like a 4-letter word, even though it's a 5-letter word. But I would hear trade and I would think like, uh-oh, we're moving away from food sovereignty, because I was born in the 1980s in the United States. And so when I think trade, I think NAFTA, I think WTO, I think about these very extractive commodity systems that move food around the world in the direction of power. And in conversation with Latrice, she reminded me that trade has been a part of indigenous food systems for a really long time. And there are lots of forms of trade that were not modeled on those colonial hierarchies or those understandings that trade is a way of reinforcing hierarchical power, that in fact, a lot of trade happened across great distances in reciprocity. And that has really opened my mind too about food systems and animals and plants that are important to folks. And I love Latrice often, when we have traveled together, has talked about like this vision of rebuilding a really robust indigenous trade network for these cultural foods. And it's got me a lot more hopeful, basically about trade, that there's a form of it that is consistent with food sovereignty. It's just not something that I've really had the opportunity to witness a whole lot in my life, given the time and place that I was born. But Latrice has helped me to see that possibility and to kind of vision that it has been that way, it is that way in certain places, and it can be that way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. It's always interesting how we unlearn and relearn the terminology, right, within a movement framework and then a systems framework, and all of the spirit of decolonizing, our language and our understanding, with a very strong emphasis on Indigenous peoples, right, and their sovereignty and all of that. Yes, many other words come to mind as you brung up trade. Me too, with you. It's yeah, it's a journey for sure. So I actually have one more question before we close out for you all. And so I'm concerned with the corporate co-optation of these terms, such as regenerative agriculture, and even like justice and food sovereignty, like the way the very oppressive system flips the switch, right, to for the language and for the narrative to work in their benefit. And so, for example, I've seen Walmart use regenerative agriculture to lift up their beliefs in how the food system should operate, right? And so please make it make sense, as the saying goes. What do we do with that? And Walmart is just one example. I mean, I think Monsanto has used it, and other terminology too. And so how do we as a movement claim right, or even ownership, or just protect our narratives and our terms without this corporate seizure that's aiming to co-opt our resistance?
I guess one of the things that comes to mind is just kind of some of the work that I'm doing, in looking at how carbon credits are really corporations buying, things from farmers and ranchers to say they're offsetting their emissions, when in reality they're buying credits from farmers and ranchers who are putting in regenerative work into their operations. And so for me, I have a hard time because I feel like wherever there's a hot term or a hot phrase, then there is going to be a way, it's going to be utilized in a way for monetary gain or value. And so I guess it's hard for me as an individual, because regardless of the terms, someone is always going to turn it into something that will benefit them, whether it's a positive or negative in intention. And I think that's when you yourself are like, is this, you make the judgment based on, are the practices that they're doing, are they really, doing this for the environment? Are they doing it because it's the hottest ticket item that looks environmental friendly, and that's the way our companies want to go? And so for me, I try to look at it more at an individual basis when I'm working with different organizations, especially when we are looking at carbon smart credits and looking at different companies who are like, hey, we want to buy your rancher's carbon, and this is what we can offer them. And I'm like, what companies are you working with? You know what I mean? And so that's really became one of the things that I was had to become more aware of, because at first I thought the carbon credit system was just, looking at the farmers' practices, but I didn't realize that it was being sold to these larger corporations. So for me, when I learned that, it hit me differently. And, it's just, I don't know how as a society we come away from that, because I just, I I was like, I'm still dumbfounded by that. I'm just like, how are our producers working harder on the land, but these guys are getting reward for it, and these guys are going to be getting, pennies compared to what these corporations are making, but they're checking a box. And so, I'm still left confused by that, and in looking at how these terms are used for monetary value. So that's still where I'm at with that.
Yeah, it's tough. I share your question. And I'll be really eager to hear either of your insights on this question forever as I continue myself, trying to navigate all of this. I do think it's really, really important to emphasize the leadership of Indigenous communities and communities of color. And if there's one really key thing that I learned in researching this book, it's that these deep regenerative approaches to food systems in Indigenous communities and communities of color are rooted in reciprocal relationships with land and animals and plants, and not in this kind of for-profit extraction model. And so I take a lot of heart there, and I'm very interested in projects that are about regenerative agriculture, often understood under different terms that are, much older than that one, in Indigenous communities and communities of color. Olivia Watkins from Black Farmer Fund is featured in one of the chapters of this book, and is very explicitly raising capital to support Black farmers and Black food businesses that are sustaining a model of regeneration that is outside of what white banks might ask them to do in order to meet a different kind of view of what economy means. And there's a ton of, I think, really important projects that are explicit about community leadership. And, I think in terms of talking about what regeneration even means, or entering conversations that are already happening about regeneration, I'm just really interested in trying to stoke curiosity about, okay, we want to regenerate something. So what was broken? What was extracted? Let's get clear about that, and let's look deeper than just the post-World War II era when farms started using more chemicals. And if we're clear about what it is we need to regenerate, why we're in the position of needing to regenerate in the first place, if we're really curious about what has been extracted, that's going to lead us to a much deeper answer about what regeneration and repair needs to look like. I don't know that everybody who is using the term regenerative agriculture is really down for that whole journey, but I'm hopeful that some folks are. And I also teach. I get to work with students. I get to work with young people at UC Santa Barbara, and I do find that a lot of young people in particular really do want to know the history of this place where most of them are, born and raised in the United States. And they really do want to know why they're in a climate predicament and why they're in a racial justice predicament. And they really do want to find root cause solutions. And so, in writing a book, this book is for those people. And I hope that it's a useful tool as folks find connections in their own path of that kind of deep regeneration.
So beautiful. That was a lovely way to close out. I really appreciate you all sharing your stories, and just, beautiful sentiments for us to reflect on and charge forward. So we're going to close out, and we don't have a word cloud today. And thanks everyone for joining us. Enormous gratitude, big gratitude to Latrice and Liz. And we will see you at the next event, supposedly. Right? Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.